Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 22nd week of 2017. I'm Carl Estabrook. For more than a quarter century, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either to repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things on a Stir of Might edition. I have in mind a passage from the 19th century American poem, The Vision of Sir Launfal. What is so rare as a day in June? Then if ever come perfect days. Then heaven tries earth if it be in tune, and over it softly her warm ear lays. Whether we look or whether we listen, we hear life murmur or see it glisten. Every clod feels a stir of might, an instinct within it that reaches and towers, and groping blindly above it for light, climbs to a soul in grass and flowers. That's from James Russell Lowell, American romantic poet, critic, editor, and diplomat. He's associated with the Fireside Poets, a group of New England writers of the mid-19th century. He was professor of belles lettres at Harvard College. He graduated from that college in 1838 and went on to earn a law degree from Harvard Law School. He published his first collection of poetry in 1841. He worked passionately for the
court. I assume you mean 1941.
Pardon?
I assume you mean 1941.
No, 1841.
I'm sorry.
This is the Victorian poet.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Look, there are Lowells in every century, along there. James Russell was born in 1819, I believe.
I'm sorry.
This is
the wrong
not
century.
Robert Lowell would have been a perfectly reasonable person to think about, but it's a big family.
Yeah, apparently.
This is Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where Lowells speak only to Cabots, and Cabots speak only to God. So the Lowell and Cabot connection, or the Lowell connection to Boston goes back a long ways and is found in each of these centuries.
So by the time Robert Lowell was writing his poetry and opposing the Vietnam War, correct?
Right.
Henry Cabot Lodge was our ambassador to South Vietnam at the same time.
One of the subtexts of the Vietnam War was the interfamilial Boston fight between Lowells and Cabots. That's true. And that's not entirely silly in the sense that so much of American history, and particularly of American warfare, can be deduced from conflicts and activities of the American ruling class. The American ascendancy has been responsible for American wars since the Revolution, or what we call the Revolution, and the popular interest in these wars has often been very small. You could write quite a history of American warfare in terms of the scheming that the American ascendancy does in order to get popular support for the wars that it wants to carry on for what are fundamentally economic interests of that ruling group. That's something we should be aware of and should be much more of our discussion, it seems to me. James Russell Lowell is an interesting figure here precisely because he was a passionate abolitionist, but also extremely critical of the war-making of the American upper class of which he was an intimate member. He went on to a political career, as a matter of fact. He founded the journal The Atlantic Monthly, which right now is busily promoting war in the United States.
Yes, of Jeffrey Goldberg.
Exactly. Which wasn't the case when he founded it in the 19th century. He was ambassador to Spain and then to Britain in the last years of the century. I always sort of thought he was better than he seemed, in terms of the quality of his verse. The verse is terribly Victorian and romantic to our ears, I think. But I used to live in the neighborhoods where he grew up, around the corner from his house. The house was called Elmwood on Brattle Street in Cambridge. And he was a important figure in Boston society before and after the Civil War, and probably deserves more attention for his politics maybe than his poetry, I don't know. The introduction to his collected works includes a fulsome description that begins with this paragraph. About half a mile from Craigie House, if you're a Bostonian, you know what Craigie House is. Craigie House is was a family manse also in the Brattle Street neighborhood of Cambridge, where Washington assumed command of the Revolutionary Army, which was itself a political statement because the house had been the center of the anti-war upper class in the years leading up to the American Revolution. And that included a good bit of the Massachusetts militia. Here's the introduction, gives you the flavor of this collection of his poetries. About half a mile about half a mile from the Craigie House in Cambridge, Massachusetts, on the road leading to the old town of Watertown, I lived there too, so I wanted to mention it, is Elmwood, a spacious square house set among lilac and syringa bushes and overtopped by elms. Pleasant fields are on either side, and from the windows one may look out on the Charles River winding its way among the marshes. The house itself is one of a group which before the war, and he means the War for Independence, as it was called, the American Revolution, before the war, belonged to Boston merchants and officers of the Crown who refused to take the side of the Revolutionary Party. They were against the Revolutionary War. Has a certain contemporary reference in that there's been a good deal of talk recently about the argument that's put forth by the historian Gerald Horne and others to point out for us something that we've carefully suppressed for most of the years since the 18th of April of '75, and that is the fact that the Revolutionary War, as we call it, was a war for the protection of slavery. The protection of slavery and the protection of the profits, North and South, that came from slavery. The war broke out because the American ruling class feared that Britain and the British bourgeoisie, who were jealous of the prosperity of the American bourgeoisie, was moving towards the abolition of slavery, upon which American prosperity was built. It was a war about slavery, and you find hints of it, and only hints of it, in our official mythology. See, for example, the rarely used third verse of the Star-Spangled Banner, which finally recognizes that slavery was at issue. While I've been plowing the fields of Victorian poetry, another sense of stir of might came to me. Maud Miller is a poem from 1856 written by John Greenleaf Whittier. And I remember the volume of Whittier in my parents' library, which I kept trying to read as a kid and being put off by. But in any case, this poem, Maud Miller, which is very Victorian New England, contains the well-known quotation, "For of all sad words of tongue or pen, the saddest are these, it might have been." And so you're listening to News from Neptune, a Stir of Might edition. And what might occur to you, David?
Well, let me just see. I just wanted to throw in a little footnote to what you were saying. And sometimes it's kind of fascinating who does oppose our wars. We mentioned Robert Lowell, and I picked up a book in the library recently by the historian Michael Kazin about the opponents to World War I in this country. Many of which we know as William Jennings Bryan and Eugene Debs and Helen Keller and various other people like that. But also it's always fascinating when rich and powerful people oppose our wars, as they sometimes do. And two of the opponents to that war were Andrew Carnegie and Joseph P. Kennedy. So it just sort of throws a little wrench into perhaps our understanding of how elites of certain kinds tend to not always go along with the program. You know, so maybe we can segue into that. But I have a laundry list here, okay,
All right,
Carl?
fine,
So,
good.
So
Let's
you can pick and choose.
wash our dirty laundry,
well,
shall
we have we have the recurring theme of Timothy Snyder, who
yes.
popped up again this week because he was interviewed by Amy Goodman, which really tells you a lot about what's going on in the ostensibly left media these days. And she gave him a very innocent sort of platform to state his basically neocon views, basically his you know, sort of vital centrist kind of views. So that's one thing. And as we often usually mention, the Friday columnist in Counterpunch, what Paul Street has this morning is a long review and summary and somewhat critique of David J. Garrow's new biography of President Obama, which only goes up to him becoming president, apparently. And but a very critical, it sounds like a very helpful and deconstructing of who Obama was for the first 48 years of his life, or 58, I'm sorry, however old he was when he became president in 2008. We have Jeffrey St. Clair also on Counterpunch, reprising an article that he wrote on that he's doing this on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the attack on the USS Liberty in the Mediterranean Sea during the Arab-Israeli Six-Day War of 1967. A very long and comprehensive article about the nature of what this attack was. Just throw in that Bill Gates has his summer reading list out, and what Bill Gates wants us to read among the 4 books he thinks we should be reading this summer is Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. And I found that pretty telling, that this 100-billionaire guy wants to read a sort of morality tale about the down and out people living in the hollers of Appalachia. A very interesting and good long article in the New York Times this morning by Nathan Thrall about Israel-Palestine, and summarizing why we have not had a meaningful peace there. David Brooks also in this morning's New York Times, reminding us that we should be altruistic. What happened to altruism in American political culture? Was Donald Trump really, according to David Brooks, it's basically all Donald Trump's fault? We used to have this balanced understanding that while we competed with each other, we also cared about each other. But David Brooks thinks this has been blown away with Donald Trump. And then, of course, on the table ought to be the upcoming election in Britain this Thursday, where Jeremy Corbyn appears to be making a serious run for the real Labour Party to take power there, in the midst of Brexit, and in the midst of a lot of complicated, of course, by the possible influence of the Manchester bombings on that election this coming Thursday, June 8th. And again, I have to mention this fascinating series that has been being put on by Paul Jay at the Real News Network, a series of six interviews with a Canadian, Iraqi scholar and someone who's been in the middle of much of it that has gone on in Iraq in the last 50 years or so. A man named Sabah al Nasri. Only 5 of the 6 segments are up so far. I assume the 6 will be up in a day or two, if it's not already. And I think this comprehensive 2-hour, basically, program really gives a wonderful historical overview of Iraq from the post-war period to the rise of Saddam Hussein, and a good overview of the devastating effects of American intervention in that region since World War II, and especially, say, since the overthrow of the Mossadegh government in Iran in 1953, and the manner in which el-Nasri's personal story is intertwined with this history, that of his family, really is a very compelling story, which opened my eyes about a lot of aspects that I had only dimly understood of what the history of this region was. Again, the morality tale, I guess, being that whatever this region might have been subsequent to World War II, it has been completely twisted, obviously by the fact that they have oil, and that the interest of Britain and the United States in controlling that oil has made it impossible for that region to develop in even a quote-unquote normal sort of capitalistic way that it might have. And one could say the same thing for Southeast Asia, Latin America, but in the Middle East, obviously, especially in the last 40 years, the devastating effects of that interest are obvious as we plunder on into various countries in that region. So there's my laundry list. So
thank you.
Take your ticket, and you can do with that what you want, and we'll move on. Just a few hints for your weekend reading or viewing.
There are a lot of things that I'm reminded, as a matter of fact, of the tradition in Venice, whereby laundry is hung out on lines strung across the narrow streets, the narrow walkways. There are, of course, no vehicular walkways.
Photos, yes.
And as you walk through Venice in the summer, over your head, you hear the sort of flapping of flags and so forth. And what it is people's laundry getting dry, and it adds a certain note of color, as a matter of fact, to the world's most fascinating city.
Well, let's just say I'm trying to air out the dirty laundry of American empire.
It's cleaner in Venice, I think. But in any case, let me pick a nit, so to speak, from the early part of your list. There are plenty of things that I'm sure we'll get to before the hour is out. But you mentioned, first of all, the book by the American historian Michael Kazin, about, the book is called War Against War, The American Fight for Peace, 1914 to 1918. Interesting topic, one that we were saying is horribly mythologized for most Americans, almost as much as the Second World War and the subsequent wars of the United States. It begins in many ways with the Wilson administration in the First World War. But it was Mike Kazin that I wanted to talk something about. I knew him slightly. He's a rough contemporary. We attended the same undergraduate institution where he was a notable member of a now forgotten group called Students for a Democratic Society, and after certain fissures within that group, a member of a group called the Weathermen. Both groups were part of the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement of the 1960s, when he and I were both attending what Noam Chomsky called the Academy for the Passive and Obedient in Harvard Square. He was not passive and obedient. He was very active in that anti-war movement. But he's had an interesting subsequent career, which has brought him to the position of being a professor of history at Georgetown, professor of American history at Georgetown. The only way you can describe it is to say that he's turned sharply right in his maturity, and now condemns the sorts of positions about American war that he championed as a young man. This comes through clearly in a review of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, which we talked about on this program last week. Kazin is peculiar in being a new left historian, if you like, who writes a severely critical review of Zinn's popular history, itself a real departure from the mythologized history that we were getting in 20th century America. And he concludes his review with the comment, "Bad history, albeit gilded with virtuous intentions." Now, that's damning with faint praise if I ever heard it, and indeed the review is damning. The review suggests that Zinn's history, which opened up all sorts of new areas for people who had been bred up in the sort of history taught in American secondary schools, was tendentious and inaccurate. This is not helpful. A real discussion of these issues would be worthwhile, but that's not what ex-SDSer Michael Kazin provides in his attack on Howard Zinn. No one would suggest that Zinn's People's History of the United States is the last word, even though it is a remarkable improvement on our normal American historical mythology. There's a lot more to be said, but we should be saying it, I think, not simply denigrating attempts to give a better account of American history. It's politically important. Americans are convinced of the American political virtue because of the sort of mythology that we normally get, and Zinn's was one of the first attempts to attack that.
Yeah, and I wasn't expecting much when I picked up this book by Kazin, and it seems to be a relatively comprehensive and reliable account of
He's not stupid.
anti-war protests. It doesn't. I'm not sure that the book necessarily makes the case against World War I that Howard Zinn, or against our entry into World War I, that Howard Zinn might make, but it's implied perhaps that Kazin would have opposed it if he'd been around at that time. That's all well and good. And it's all well and good to look at what the flaws of Howard Zinn's approach, his sort of bottom-up approach, is in understanding how American history actually works. So Howard Zinn popularized the idea that history is made from the bottom up as well as the top down. And there's certainly many good examples of that happening. The protests against the Vietnam War being one of them, which Zinn was active in, and which you imply Kazin was also. But it isn't that Zinn wasn't explaining to us the kind of things that you try to explain about what American interests, how American power really works, and what its goals really are. It's a different kind of history than, say, I'm often mentioning the book The Making of Global Capitalism by Leo Panitch and Sam Yinden gives a very different account of how American history works. And in fact, one of Zinn's contemporaries, and I'm sure friends, Gabriel Kolko, also has written a very different kind of history in terms of understanding, in a way, from a top-down point of view, but critical of what the top is doing, but critical, and I would argue clear-eyed, about what is going on at the upper levels of a capitalist country, where most that goes on is really pretty much but anything that really makes any difference is pretty much at the behest of the, not just the 1%, but the 0.1%. So Zinn says we can do something about that. Only the people can do something about that, and there are plenty of guides in our history for the people doing something about that. But you got to know what you're dealing with also in terms of the way this system works.
What's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge, but that depends to some extent on knowing what that prologue past is like and how we got into this position in the first place. That's an aspect of the discussion that unfortunately rarely seems to take place.
Yeah. And also Kazin is also the editor of a quarterly journal called Dissent, which is a venerable sort of social democratic journal that was formerly edited by Irving Howe and Michael Walzer. And that line of thinking got into a lot of trouble, at least after during and after the 1960s, in opposing some aspect of the good things that were happening in the 1960s. And of course, became wedded to Zionism in a certain way that really, in my argument, caused it to mute its critique of U.S. foreign policy on the basis of this belief in this sort of dreamy belief that Israel still represented a kind of socialist society and so forth. So I don't know whether dissent has really gotten over all of that. I've noticed some articles recently. I hadn't read it for years. I noticed Nancy Fraser, the feminist socialist, had an interesting critique of sort of feminist neoliberalism in dissent, and that a couple of other articles I've noticed recently. So maybe it's, and I know that their work on labor has always been pretty good. There's a labor journalist who named Sarah Jaffe who's been associated with them recently. So it's never been all bad. It's just that I could never tolerate their basically becoming neocons.
Yes, that's exactly right. And I had the same experience. The two you mentioned were respectively proponents of the Vietnam War and of Israel's '67 war. I actually knew the latter in an anti-war group in that same bucolic Boston that we were talking about earlier, but that was long ago and far away, and that particular political movement is dead.
And I always had a soft spot for Irving Howe also, because
Really?
he wrote a wonderful book called World of Our Fathers. Maybe I wouldn't think of it as wonderful if I read it over again, but it was a very good account of Jewish political and literary culture in lower New York East Side in the turn of the century, and filled with the sort of sentimentality that I like, and so it was sort of hard for me to compute later on that he's sort of he's part of this old left, this complicated old left business, which had its good and bad aspects to it, but again, long ago and far away. So let's perhaps we should move on.
Well, maybe so. Dissent. I think you're absolutely right in talking about the vagaries of dissent and its political tradition, and the tergiversations, in one of our favorite words. Of
your favorite words.
Only because it describes so accurately what happens to American
I can't
intellectual and political. That's probably good, you know. If you can't say it, you can't do it. Maybe, I don't know. But in any case, I was going to try to say something nice about dissent, and I actually came up with something. They published just before the Brexit vote, the vote for Britain to leave the European Union. They published an article by Richard Tuck, a man of the same generation of the people we've been talking about for the most part, but a Brit who teaches now at the Academy for the Passive and Obedient. And he wrote the most cogent argument I saw of why the left should support Brexit, should support the leaving of the European Union by Britain, by the UK. He made the argument that basically what the European Union was a large trade pact like NAFTA or the TPP or something of that sort, and that the left that contended that progress on the left depends upon breaking through these attempts to produce business control of politics, and that Brexit, in fact, was a contribution in that direction. And he had a cogent account of why this was true in the history of the British Labour Party, with some very interesting comments about the notion of constitutionalism and the way in which constitutions are, in effect, methods of solidifying the rule of the ruling class. This should be nothing new to Americans. In the United States, the first historian, if you like, of the American Constitution, James Madison, said at the time that the purpose of the construction of the 1789 Constitution of the U.S. Constitution was to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. His notion was the Constitution had to be put in place because if it weren't, the democratic enthusiasms brought forth by the Revolutionary War would mean that the majority in the United States, in the states which were about to be united, would demand what in 18th century political parlance was an agrarian law. An agrarian law meant a division of property, an equalization of property. Agrarian law, wealth in the 18th century came from the fields, the ager, and from the fields, the dominance of the American bourgeoisie grew because they owned it. And the fear of the American upper class, North and South, after the Revolutionary War, the thing that led to Daniel Shays' rebellion, for example, was the possibility that Americans would say, let us now divide up the wealth that we have secured from Britain and establish equality in property in the United States. That can't happen from the point of view of the American ascendancy, the 18th century 1%, if you like. And so they designed a constitution that would prevent that from happening. We've had a recent reminder of that in the fuss around the Electoral College in the last presidential election. That was part of this mechanism set up by those we call the Founding Fathers to protect their money, to protect their wealth. And the workings of constitutionalism in that regard is not part of our mythology. Our mythology is that the constitutions provide democracy, right? Well, in fact, constitutions by their nature are anti-democratic institutions. They're to prevent the people from voting in ways that would threaten the wealth of the well-to-do. You can find this all described in some detail in Marx writing about constitutionalism in France in the 1840s. But that argument was not much made in response to the Brexit vote, the vote to leave the European Union, but it raises all the questions that we've been talking about this evening, it seems to me, and I'm happy to say that Dissent was the one journal that published a cogent account of this argument, and that's Richard Tuck's argument, and I recommend it if anyone would like to follow out these issues.
Yeah, and it seemed like Tariq Ali was pretty lonely on the left.
Yes.
Who has been the longtime editor of the New Left Review, which has sort of held up its end of the deal over all these decades, unlike Dissent. But in any event, Tariq Ali was pretty lonely on the left in relation to his support for Brexit, sort of resisting the accusations that you're supporting the racists and the nationalists and all that kind of stuff. And it's a tough go. I mean, when you're out there by yourself pretty much, and being called, having all these aspersions cast upon you, to kind of say, well, this was the right thing. And Corbyn himself, of course, did not support Brexit. He, opposed it in a certain way that was maybe obviously different than it was opposed by the Tories. But anyway, this is what's all being played out in Britain at this time in this very fascinating way. Let me note that one thing that the Real News Network has incorporated now is a series of interviews that are being done in Britain by something called Real Media, and they tend to be sort of short 10-minute interviews, very, very rich, very, very crisply done with certain people who have been talking lately a lot about Jeremy Corbyn and the effects of neoliberalism and Brexit. And I did mention the interview they did with David Graeber, I think, a couple of weeks ago. But they've done a few more since then, and so that's another feature that's been sort of incorporated into the Real News called Real. I think it's called Reality Media or something like that. Real Media. So.
You're watching News from Neptune. I thought the most striking story of the week actually came from the much despised Russian media RT. RT is sort of like the BBC for Russia, and the only difference is that RT is not quite so slanted politically as the BBC is, I think. But that is a independent news organization, in theory, that is financed by a government. We're familiar with such arrangements, but this one seems to be a good deal more independent of the political position of its sponsoring government than the BBC has certainly recently. But it was RT that was the source of the account of what I found the most interesting and hilarious response to Donald Trump's removal of the U.S. from the Paris Climate Accords, which caused such consternation, not unreasonably, or some of it at least wasn't unreasonable. A good bit of it, I think, was part of the same sort of Trump bashing that we've come to expect from the political establishment. But then again, they had something to bash about. The removal of the U.S. from the climate accords is certainly a mistake. And it's worse than a crime. It's a blunder. The excoriation of the president for this action arises from a vast mixture of motives, including all the Russiagate nonsense that we're hearing from Democrats, neocons, Pentagoners, spooks, the so-called deep state. But it was Vladimir Putin who, in his stand-up act almost, did the best job of giving an account of what it meant. He was speaking at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, a regular meeting, I think roughly like what's the American analog that we would think of for this? Almost like Davos for Russia or for Eurasia
or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. In any case, he said the panic surrounding Trump's decision had been blown way out of proportion, noting that there's still time before the agreement, which was signed in 2015, goes into effect. And as he made this point, he says in the middle of it in English, "Don't worry, be happy." This is in the midst of his, in Russian, of course, account of how Russia saw Trump's withdrawal of the U.S. from the Paris Accords. Quote, "This agreement," the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, "has not yet even come into effect," he said. "It will come into effect in 2021, so we still have time. If we all work constructively, we can agree on something," he said. Now, there's an interesting parallel here in terms of Russian relationship with France and Germany that we might talk about in a few minutes. But what he goes on to say about the U.S. seems to me to be right. Putin says the U.S. has ratified this agreement, as I recall, but we, meaning he means Russia, have not yet, he added. "We haven't done this because we want to wait until when the rules of allocation of resources and other technical but important issues are ironed out." The notion of an ongoing discussion on this whole issue of climate change. The Paris Accords were worked out in 2015 to replace the Kyoto Protocol on greenhouse gas emissions. Russia is one of its 195 signatories, but is yet to ratify the document. But the document itself has been seriously criticized by people who are saying that it's a wish list and goes nowhere near far enough for what's necessary. So Putin says, "Hey, look, you know, the store is open. Let's talk about this."
Yeah. I'm sorry.
I'm stepping on Putin's best line here.
Yeah, okay. The consequences for that could be dire. Given his history.
That's you sound like. Putin says, I quote, "It's about preventing temperature changes of 2 degrees, he reminded the audience, noting that we here at the forum somehow do not yet feel that the temperature is rising, close quote. By the way, we should be grateful to President Trump. In Moscow, it's raining and cold, and even, they say, some snow. Now we could all blame this on the American imperialism, and it's all their fault. But we won't," he says. I mean, Russiagate in reverse in regard to climate. He, in fact, in this speech, would not only made jokes about what the U.S. was doing in this regard, but he did point out that Russia was committed to the Paris deal and, as he suggested before, to its improvement. Don't worry, be happy, says Vladimir Putin, which is a far better response, I think, to Putin's actions than the vast condemnation that the American political establishment has provided.
You mean Trump's actions?
What did I say?
You said Putin's actions.
Oh, no,
Okay,
it's Putin's response to Trump's actions
Trump's
that's
actions.
at stake. And
Okay,
Putin's response seems to me both intelligent and progressive, for lack of a better term.
This is a side of Putin I haven't seen before or heard about before. But I guess I came in here after looking at the front web page of the New York Times, which is plastered with criticisms of Donald Trump's action.
You're right,
which,
sure.
which you
What a
appropriately
surprising.
condemn. But still, we have to wonder what's the motives of the people writing on the front pages. From
Exactly.
Bill, I mean, even from Bill, McKibben on the sort of environmentalist left or progressive
liberal. Yeah.
Environmentalist movement.
Strong. Strongly criticized by our environmentalist editor Jeffrey Sinclair of Counterpunch.
Yes. So, so what we've got here is, what you want to ask is, what was really in the agreement in the first place that causes optimism in terms of dealing with climate change. The idea that's emphasized in more than one of these articles has to do with the idea of American leadership, that we're somehow sacrificing leadership.
Yeah.
I would say that in general that would be a good thing if America was ceding its leadership role in the world, which these people cling to, and what they mean by leadership is what we say goes.
Exactly.
So we have to ask what the relationship is to what we say goes. We're controlling global capitalism, and whatever environmental measures are being taken that don't necessarily conflict with this, but could probably go much further, except for that they could conflict with that, and then they talk about, well, this corporation and this leader is appalled by Trump also. Well, what's that about? Of course, that's about profit. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't be making money in capitalism off of resisting or meeting climate change, but still we need more than economic motives, than profit motives in our struggle against climate change. Just doing it when it's convenient for the profits of American corporations or multinational corporations, that's not going to do it. So there's this undercurrent of motives, and I know we don't like to talk that much about motives, but it's ideological. It's transparent and obvious that the climate change movement and the sort of the pro-science movement and so forth has to conform to certain dictates of U.S. corporate power, neoliberalism, and continued American control of global capitalism.
Exactly.
And it would be all too the best if Russia and China and whomever else in Europe would say, okay, America doesn't want to do this, so we'll step up. Now, I'm not saying they're going to do it in any different context.
But yes, I think you're absolutely right, and there's some indication they're doing that. The Chinese, particularly interestingly, because they have some real problems on this in this area that they're actually moving on locally. I was lucky enough to be in Hong Kong and Beijing last year in the midst of one of their pollution crises in Beijing, and it was very interesting. Beijing is not only a huge city, it's also built in the bottom of a bowl. And so pollution gathers in and around the city. The Chinese leadership, which is, aware of its problems, is moving on that far more than the American leadership is in regard to pollution in Los Angeles, say. It's really
They dealt with that pretty well over the years.
But California did, right?
Well, L.A. did too. California.
No, I meant, but the level didn't come. It wasn't the federal level that it was, in fact, the state level that dealt with that.
It
right?
actually reminded me of L.A. when you talked about Beijing being the bottom of a bowl, because LA's in the bottom of a bowl also. So, but anyway, that aside.
No, but I think it's important in that it says something about how the various governments are dealing with these questions, the major question of climate change, the, in some sense, more local question of pollution, and also the second point, how they're spinning what they're doing, how they're explaining what they're doing. Typically, we got from the last administration a disingenuous report about the government's support for anti-pollution and anti-climate change activities. We get a more honest, if not finally different, account from this administration. But the real discussion of what should be done is so thoroughly politicized in this country that a great threat to human felicity is being manipulated for private profit. And that's what we need to oppose. And it seems to me that a lot of this viewing with alarm of Trump's action this week has to be understood in part in terms of that same propaganda campaign against the current president by the political establishment. And that's very serious. I mean, you mentioned Counterpunch collection of articles this week. Did you see Andrew Levine's piece on?
I noticed it.
Yeah.
Skimmed
This
it a
is,
little bit.
I think this is a sort of dangerous notion growing up among good liberals here, that Trump is the problem. And in fact, I think he's not. The problem is American war making and, as you were saying earlier, David, American worldwide capitalism. Those are the things that have to be dealt with. The problem is, in order to deal with them, we have to break through this solid carapace of American propaganda, explaining to us that there's really nothing going on behind that curtain.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about it is that when you read all these articles in the New York Times or the mainstream media, I assume in the Washington Post it's the same thing. The point is that the climate change is part of building the case for impeaching Trump, even if he can't be impeached for the climate change issue, which is the most important thing, one of the most important things. But it's like weakening resistance to the idea that the president should be impeached and convicted. That's what's being done here. So you have to see the intensity, not just the substance, but the tone and the arrangement of all these issues in the mainstream media as making this case. And if that's an appropriate thing to be doing right now, if it's an appropriate thing for people on the left to be caring about whether the president is Donald Trump or Mike Pence. And I know Andrew Levine was, he was one of the people, he's a good writer, he's a clever man, and I think he's a genuine leftist in some ways, but he predicted that there was no way Trump could win. He predicted to the last second that there was no way Trump could win, and now he's kind of capitulating to the idea that, well, now that he did win, the best thing would be to get rid of him and just move on. And I think that's wrong. That's just a wrong tactic at this point in time for the left to be taking.
One of the issues I think that became clear this week is that we really did, in this last presidential election, we really did not elect the crazier candidate. Now I say that because Hillary Clinton spoke at something called Code 2017, a convention basically of computer people, this last week, and gave an absolutely remarkable series of interviews and comments about the election. She explained that the fact that she lost, and remember last week she took full responsibility for what the campaign did, but it wasn't her fault that they lost, which was an interesting locution right then. But she expanded that this week by saying that her loss was the work, and I'm quoting here now, of 1,000 Russian agents in collaboration with the Donald Trump campaign. Now, what the 1,000 Russian agents did was fill the airways with fake news, and fake news convinced those Americans who voted against her to do so. It was Trump's and the Russians' fault. Now, this is not coming from, some right-wing Congress critter. This is Hillary Clinton's account of her campaign as of this week. I'm not sure about this. I'm quite sure about what she says. What I'm not sure about is her sanity. I was actually surprised at the line that she took and what she said there. And it was, I read the first account of the interview in a British right-wing newspaper, and I said, they're making this up. This can't be true. And so I went and looked at the interview from which it came, and it's all true. That's what she did say. She's crazy as a bedbug. And this is very interesting. I think actually it will put a crimp in the style of the political establishment who are trying to run Trump out in the way you were just describing, because Clinton is obviously nuts.
Well, I'm starting to think that if you got Amy Goodman interviewing Timothy Snyder and Hillary Clinton at the same time, you would have three people that are pretty much on the edge there. Although I have to say, just to compensate a little bit, I do recommend the interviews that Amy Goodman did with Dilma Rousseff, the ousted leader of Brazil. So she makes up a little bit for what she's doing, but it's hard to understand what this descent into anti-Trumpian madness has wrought upon what is still the leading sort of liberal left alternative media program.
Well, and there was another interesting note this week on the same theme, and that is the fact that the anti-Trump forces, the political establishment forces, have for a while dined out on the interesting figure of the premier of North Korea and assumed that one of the reasons Trump was so dangerous is because he and the North Korean premier would come to blows, and those blows would be the prelude to a third world war. The Korean danger was cried up by the American political establishment because of the craziness of the leaders on both sides. Now, in fact, this was in many ways pure propaganda, pure American propaganda of the highest sort. Our mentor Noam Chomsky said this week, remember, the goal is to get North Korea to freeze its weapons systems, weapons and missile systems. The great danger that they pose is what the Trump administration is talking about. So one proposal is to accept the North Korean offer to do exactly that. Now, that's something that's not been much reported in American media, that the crazy leader of North Korea has offered to freeze their missile and weapons system just as the U.S. has asked. And by the way, the proposal isn't new. This proposal has been on the table for a while. China and North Korea together offered that proposal during the Obama administration, and the U.S., Obama, instantly rejected it. The Trump administration continues to reject the proposal for a stand down on weapons, and nuclear production that North Korea offers. Now, do you hear that in the American media? No, you don't. You don't, because the American political establishment has got to keep up the narrative that there's this crazy danger coming from North Korea, and we've got a crazy man in Washington now who just might take them up on it, and if he can get his aircraft carriers going in the right direction, push a button and produce a war. Now, this is an amazing story, and as I say, can be understood only in the context of American politics and the way in which the political establishment is attempting to create its own reality in the minds of most Americans. And on the whole, they're succeeding, I think. You've been watching News from Neptune. For the 22nd week of 2017, a Stir of Might edition, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, and produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Joseph Cash, and Ender Scalare, with our thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. Inshallah, we'll be back next week. We've got an outgo here. We have a minute or two, I think.
Do we? How much do we have?
Well, you've got like another minute or so.
Okay.
I got nothing really.
Sort of like the Trump administration.
Yeah. I think I'm all. I mean, I would just say, let's talk more about the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War.
Oh yes, definitely.
Next week.
Next week, definitely.
And for homework, maybe perhaps read Norman Finkelstein's critique of Michael Oren's horrible book about the Six-Day War.
That's a week
which
from
you
today.
Can find online.
50th anniversary is a week from today.
Yeah, right.
Inshallah, we will be back a week from today with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.